Hey guys, tonight we're diving into wedding traditions so deadly that most brides didn't survive their own ceremonies. Picture this. You're standing at the altar, but instead of exchanging rings, you're watching your future mother-in-law slice open a sheep's belly to read your romantic destiny in its steaming entrails. The blood drips onto your white dress as she frowns. The omens aren't good. In the next few minutes, you'll discover how ancient Roman weddings turned into literal death sentences, and by the end of tonight's journey, you'll understand why modern couples should thank their lucky stars they only have to worry about drunk uncles and bad DJ choices. Here's what'll shock you: Roman brides underwent haruspicy, fortune-telling through animal sacrifice, not as some optional ceremony, but as a mandatory pre-wedding requirement. The priests would gut everything from chickens to bulls, searching for divine approval in the texture of livers and the color of intestines. But here's the twisted part that breaks all expectations. If the omens were bad, the wedding didn't just get postponed, it got permanently cancelled, often with the bride being declared cursed and unmarriageable for life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where this crazy historical journey reaches around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're transported back to 150 BC Rome, standing in the Forum Boreum as dawn breaks over the seven hills. The air reeks of incense mixed with fresh blood, and you can hear the nervous bleating of sacrificial animals echoing off marble columns. Today isn't just any day, it's your wedding day, and you're about to participate in one of history's most dangerous matrimonial traditions. The haruspice, Rome's official fortune-teller, approaches with his ceremonial bronze knife gleaming in the morning light. This isn't some village witch doctor we're talking about. This is a state-appointed religious official whose word could literally make or break your entire future. You watch as he selects a pristine white sheep, its wool recently washed and perfumed for this sacred moment. The animal seems to sense its fate, shifting restlessly as the priest begins his incantations. What you're witnessing represents the intersection of religion, politics, and pure superstition that defined Roman society. Every major decision, from declaring war to choosing a spouse, required divine approval through entrail examination. The practice, called extispicy, had been imported from Etruscan culture centuries earlier and had become so embedded in Roman tradition that even emperors wouldn't dare skip it. The knife descends with practiced precision, and you force yourself not to look away as the haruspice begins his grisly work. He's searching for specific signs: the liver's color and texture, the heart's condition, the lungs' appearance. Each organ tells part of your matrimonial story, and frankly, you're starting to wonder if maybe eloping to Gaul might have been the smarter choice. Historians still argue whether haruspices actually believed in their craft or simply used it as a tool for political manipulation, but one thing's certain: their pronouncements carried life or death weight. A bad reading didn't just mean rescheduling, it could brand you as cursed by the gods themselves. The priest's face grows grave as he examines the sheep's liver. The left lobe appears darker than expected, and there's an unusual spot near the gall bladder that makes him frown deeply. Your heart pounds as he whispers consultations with his assistants, their voices too low to hear but their expressions telling the whole story. Here's where things get really twisted. If the omens declared your union cursed, Roman law actually prohibited the marriage from proceeding. You couldn't just find another priest or try again next week. The gods had spoken, and their word was final. Some unlucky brides found themselves permanently unmarriageable, condemned to lives of spinsterhood because a sheep's liver looked slightly off color on their big day. The social implications were devastating. In a society where a woman's worth was largely measured by her ability to produce legitimate heirs, being declared matrimonially cursed was essentially a death sentence for your bloodline. Families would sometimes spend fortunes on multiple ceremonies, sacrificing dozens of animals in hopes of finally receiving divine approval. But here's the part that'll really make your skin crawl. Some haruspices were known to deliberately misread omens for political purposes. Imagine discovering that your lifelong spinsterhood resulted not from divine displeasure, but from some corrupt priest who'd been bribed by your fiancé's political enemies. Talk about the ultimate wedding crasher. The haruspice finally renders his verdict, but your relief is short-lived because now you're facing an even deadlier wedding tradition, one that makes reading sheepguts look like a harmless party game. You've just been transported to medieval Europe, where romantic courtship often began with armed men breaking down your door in the middle of the night. Welcome to the world of bridal abduction, where kidnapping wasn't just socially acceptable. It was practically a dating app with swords. You're lying in your bed in a 12th century Saxon village when you hear hoofbeats thundering toward your family's cottage. The sound grows louder, more urgent, and suddenly your wooden door explodes inward as 3 masked horsemen storm into your home. This isn't random violence we're talking about. This is courtship, medieval style. The practice known as marriage by capture, or bride theft, was so widespread across Europe that most legal systems had specific laws governing how it should be conducted. Think of it as Tinder, but with significantly more potential for actual death. The lead horseman throws a burlap sack over your head before you can even scream, and you're hoisted onto a horse faster than you can say, "I haven't even brushed my teeth yet." Your abductor spurs his mount into a gallop, and you're bouncing along in complete darkness, wondering if this is how your love story begins or how your life ends. Here's what makes this tradition particularly twisted. In many medieval societies, once you'd been, successfully, kidnapped and held for a certain period, usually 3 days, the marriage was considered legally binding whether you consented or not. The logic was beautifully circular. If you'd been alone with a man for 3 days, your virtue was automatically compromised, so you might as well marry him to salvage what remained of your reputation. The Germanic tribes were especially enthusiastic about this practice, treating bride theft as both a rite of passage for young men and a legitimate form of marriage negotiation. Your kidnapper might have been courting you for months, sending gifts and love poems, but if your father refused his marriage proposal, well, sometimes a man just had to take matters into his own hands. Historians still argue whether most medieval bride thefts were genuine abductions or elaborate theatrical performances designed to circumvent parental disapproval, but the physical dangers were real either way. You're galloping through a dark forest on an unfamiliar horse, held by a man whose face you can't even see, with no guarantee that his intentions are honorable or that you'll survive the night. The ride seems to last forever, your body aching from the awkward position and the horse's jarring gait. Finally, you feel the animal slow to a walk, then stop completely. Strong hands lift you down, and the sack is pulled from your head. You find yourself standing in a torchlit clearing surrounded by a dozen armed men, all grinning at you like you're the evening's entertainment. But here's where the tradition gets even more dangerous. Bride theft often triggered blood feuds between families that could last for generations. Your father and brothers are probably already sharpening their swords, preparing to either rescue you or avenge your honor. Meanwhile, your abductor's family is fortifying their stronghold, ready to defend their son's romantic gesture to the death. The legal complications were mind-boggling. In some regions, a successful bride theft automatically transferred property rights from your father to your new husband. In others, your family could demand compensation, essentially turning you into a very expensive commodity whose price was negotiated after the fact. And if your kidnapper decided he didn't actually want to marry you after the 3-day waiting period? Well, congratulations, you were now damaged goods that no respectable man would touch. The practice was so common that the Catholic Church eventually had to issue specific decrees against it, though enforcement was spotty at best. Pope Alexander III declared in 1179 that marriages resulting from abduction were invalid. But try explaining canon law to a sword-wielding Saxon who's just won himself a bride through superior horsemanship and questionable ethics. Your captor finally speaks, removing his mask to reveal a face you actually recognize. It's the blacksmith's son from the neighboring village, the one who's been making eyes at you during market days. Don't be afraid, he says with what he probably thinks is a reassuring smile. We'll be wed by sunrise, and then you'll be the happiest woman in 3 counties. You're not entirely convinced that happiness and survival are guaranteed outcomes here. But as the night drags on, you start to notice the eerie silence of the forest around you. No crickets chirp, no owls hoot, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the cold wind. The men around you exchange whispered conversations, their faces illuminated by flickering torchlight, revealing scars and hardened expressions that tell stories of past battles and long-standing grudges. You try to steady your breathing, feeling the weight of the burlap sack still loosely tied around your neck. Your mind races with questions. Will your family come to rescue you? Will your captor truly honor his promise? Or is this just the beginning of a nightmare that will haunt you for the rest of your life? The temperature drops as midnight approaches, and you notice frost beginning to form on the grass beneath your feet. Your thin nightgown offers little protection against the biting wind, and you can't help but shiver uncontrollably. One of the men throws a rough woolen cloak over your shoulders, a gesture that might seem kind if it weren't coming from your kidnappers. The blacksmith's son notices your discomfort and moves closer, his breath visible in the cold air as he speaks. The ceremony will be brief, he promises, pulling out a small leather pouch containing what appears to be herbs and strange powders. These are blessed by the village wise woman. They'll ensure our union is fruitful and our children strong. You're not sure whether to be comforted or terrified by this revelation. Historians still debate whether these abductions were mostly consensual or violent, but one thing is clear: the emotional toll on the women involved was immense. Some accounts describe brides who eventually accepted their fate, while others tell of desperate attempts to escape or tragic ends. The psychological trauma of being torn from your family and forced into marriage with a stranger was something that haunted many women for the rest of their lives. As dawn approaches, the first light filters through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. Your captor kneels beside you, producing a small wooden box containing a ring, an ancient symbol of binding promises and uncertain futures. He slips it onto your finger, sealing your fate in a way that words never could. Just as you begin to accept your fate, a sudden rustling in the bushes catches everyone's attention. A shadowy figure emerges, cloaked in darkness, carrying a torch that flickers wildly in the cold night air. It's your older brother, leading a small band of villagers armed with pitchforks and makeshift weapons, ready to storm the clearing and rescue you from this grim fate. The tension skyrockets as the two groups face off, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of damp earth. Your heart pounds in your chest, caught between hope and fear. Will this rescue attempt succeed, or will it ignite a brutal battle that leaves everyone scarred? Remember that sheep and trail reading from earlier? This moment makes that look like a pleasant afternoon picnic. The clash of steel rings through the forest as your brother's rescue attempt erupts into chaos. But that medieval nightmare pales in comparison to what you're about to experience in ancient China, where wedding preparation wasn't just painful. It was a decade-long torture ritual that literally reshaped your bones. You're now a 7-year-old girl in the Song dynasty, sitting on a low wooden stool while your grandmother approaches with silk bandages and a look of grim determination. Today marks the beginning of your foot-binding journey, a grotesque beauty ritual that will prepare you for marriage by systematically breaking and reshaping your feet into 3-inch golden lotuses. The process begins with your grandmother soaking your feet in a mixture of herbs and animal blood, supposedly to soften the bones and prevent infection. The liquid is warm against your skin, but there's an underlying metallic smell that makes your stomach churn. You can see other girls from your village who've already undergone this transformation, hobbling on their tiny, deformed feet like broken dolls. Your grandmother starts by bending your 4 smaller toes underneath your foot, pressing them against the sole with enough force to make you cry out. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. Imagine someone deliberately breaking your fingers and then forcing you to keep them in that position for the rest of your life. She wraps the silk bandages tightly around your foot, creating a binding so restrictive that your circulation immediately begins to slow. Here's the twisted logic behind this practice. In Chinese society, tiny feet were considered the ultimate symbol of feminine beauty and marriageability. The smaller your feet, the more desirable you became as a bride, and the higher your family could climb in social status. Women with natural, unbound feet were considered peasants, unmarriageable, and destined for lives of manual labor. The binding process requires daily rewrapping, each session tighter than the last. Your grandmother explains that your bones need to be gradually broken and reformed, your arch forced into an impossible curve that will eventually allow you to balance your entire body weight on your heel and big toe. The other toes will essentially disappear, crushed and folded under until they're nothing more than decorative bumps. Historians still argue whether foot binding originated as a practical way to keep women confined to their homes or as a purely aesthetic choice, but the medical consequences were undeniable. Many girls died from infections when the tight bindings cut off circulation entirely, causing gangrene and sepsis. Others survived but lived with chronic pain, unable to walk more than a few steps without assistance. The daily routine becomes a nightmare of agony and endurance. Every morning, your grandmother unwraps the bandages, revealing feet that are increasingly swollen, bruised, and misshapen. She washes away the pus and blood with rice wine, then applies fresh herbs before rewrapping even tighter than before. The smell of rotting flesh becomes a constant companion, and you learn to breathe through your mouth to avoid gagging. As months pass, you feel your bones actually shifting and breaking under the constant pressure. The arch of your foot develops an unnatural curve, forcing your heel and toes closer together until your foot resembles a crescent moon more than a human appendage. Walking becomes impossible without assistance, and you spend most of your time sitting or lying down, practicing the delicate needlework that will make you an attractive bride. The social pressure is immense. Your future mother-in-law will literally measure your feet before agreeing to any marriage contract. 3 inches is considered perfect, 4 inches acceptable, and anything larger marks you as undesirable. Your entire romantic future depends on how successfully your bones can be tortured into submission. But here's what makes this tradition particularly insidious. The process was irreversible. Once your feet were bound and deformed, there was no going back. Even if you later decided the pain wasn't worth it, your bones had been permanently altered, leaving you disabled for life. Some women who tried to unbind their feet found they could no longer walk at all, their muscles and tendons too damaged to support their weight. The psychological impact was equally devastating. You're essentially being taught that your natural body is disgusting and unacceptable, that love and marriage require you to mutilate yourself beyond recognition. The constant pain becomes normalized, and you learn to associate suffering with femininity and beauty. Your grandmother tells you stories of famous beauties whose feet were so perfectly bound that they could barely walk, requiring servants to carry them everywhere. These women were held up as ideals, their helplessness considered the height of feminine grace. You're supposed to aspire to this level of disability, to see your increasing inability to move as a sign of your growing attractiveness. The binding continues for years, each day bringing fresh agony as your feet are forced into an ever smaller shape. By your teenage years, you can barely stand without support, and walking more than a few steps leaves you breathless with pain. Your feet have become grotesque parodies of their original form, but according to society's standards, you're now beautiful enough to attract a wealthy husband. The irony is crushing. This tradition designed to make you more marriageable actually makes you less capable of being a functional wife and mother. You can't work in the fields, can't chase after children, can't even flee if your home catches fire. You've been transformed into a living ornament, beautiful but utterly helpless. As your wedding day approaches, you practice the tiny, shuffling steps that are considered graceful and alluring. Each movement sends shooting pains up your legs, but you've learned to hide your suffering behind a serene smile. After all, a good wife never complains about the sacrifices she's made for beauty. Remember that medieval bride kidnapping we just witnessed? At least those women could still run. Those bound feet might have made walking impossible, but at least Chinese brides didn't have to worry about having their ribcages split open while still breathing, a privilege reserved for Viking wedding guests who got to witness the blood eagle ceremony, where enemy captives were tortured to death to ensure the gods blessed the matrimonial union. You're standing on a windswept cliff in 9th century Norway, watching as Viking warriors drag a captured Saxon chieftain toward a crude stone altar. The bride and groom stand hand in hand, their faces painted with ritual symbols, while the Jarl raises his ceremonial axe and announces that this wedding requires a blood sacrifice worthy of Odin himself. The prisoner's screams echo across the fjord as you realize you're about to witness one of history's most brutal wedding traditions. The blood eagle wasn't just random violence. It was a meticulously planned ritual execution designed to demonstrate the groom's worthiness and secure divine favor for the marriage. The victim, usually a high-ranking enemy captured in battle, would be positioned face down on the altar while the executioner used a sharp knife to cut through the ribs along the spine. You can hear the sickening crack of bone as each rib is severed and pulled outward, creating the wings that give this torture method its name. What makes this particularly horrifying is that the victim remains conscious throughout most of the procedure. The executioner carefully avoids damaging vital organs, ensuring the prisoner can witness his own lungs being pulled out through his back and arranged like bloody wings across his shoulders. The entire process can take hours, with the victim's agonized breathing providing a gruesome soundtrack to the wedding festivities. Viking society believed that the more prestigious the victim and the more spectacular their death, the greater the honor bestowed upon the newlyweds. A blood eagle performed on a captured king or famous warrior was considered the ultimate wedding gift, guaranteeing fertility, prosperity, and protection from enemies. The bride would often participate by offering the victim's blood to the gods, drinking from a ceremonial horn, while the man slowly died behind her. The practical implications were staggering. Imagine the diplomatic consequences of torturing foreign nobility to death at your wedding reception. These ceremonies often triggered decades-long wars between kingdoms, as the victim's family and allies sought revenge for the ritualized murder. Your romantic celebration literally became a declaration of war against entire nations. Historians still argue whether the blood eagle was primarily a religious ritual or a psychological warfare tactic designed to terrorize enemies, but contemporary accounts describe the procedure in nauseating detail. The Orkneyinga saga mentions King Edmund of East Anglia suffering this fate, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records similar executions performed during royal weddings throughout Scandinavia. The religious significance was deeply rooted in Norse mythology, where Odin himself was said to have undergone similar torments to gain wisdom and power. By inflicting the blood eagle on their enemies, Viking couples were essentially offering the ultimate sacrifice to the All-Father, demonstrating their willingness to endure any hardship for their love. The fact that they were torturing someone else to prove their devotion apparently didn't strike anyone as contradictory. You watch in horror as the executioner reaches into the victim's chest cavity, carefully extracting the lungs without puncturing them. The organs are then draped over the protruding ribs, creating a grotesque parody of wings while the prisoner continues to gasp for air. Salt is sometimes rubbed into the wounds to intensify the agony and prevent the victim from losing consciousness too quickly. The bride approaches the altar, her wedding dress already stained with blood from the ceremony. She dips her fingers into the victim's wounds and marks her forehead with crimson symbols, invoking Frigg's blessing for a fruitful marriage. The groom follows suit, painting war marks on his cheeks while chanting prayers to Thor for strength in battle and prowess in the marriage bed. The psychological impact on wedding guests must have been immense. You're literally watching someone die in the most agonizing way possible while celebrating love and new beginnings. The juxtaposition of extreme violence and romantic joy created a cognitive dissonance that probably haunted witnesses for years. Some accounts describe guests fainting or vomiting during the ceremony, unable to reconcile the brutality with the supposed celebration. But here's the truly twisted part. If the victim managed to survive the entire blood eagle procedure without crying out or begging for mercy, it was considered an omen that the marriage would be blessed with exceptional courage and honor. The prisoner's stoic endurance in the face of unimaginable agony was seen as a gift to the newlyweds, his suffering transformed into their strength. The cleanup alone must have been a nightmare. Imagine trying to remove gallons of blood and human remains from your wedding venue while your guests tried to enjoy the feast. The altar would be permanently stained, serving as a grisly reminder of your special day for years to come. Some couples kept pieces of their victims' bones as wedding mementos, displaying them in their homes like macabre trophies. The practice eventually declined as Christianity spread through Scandinavia, but not before centuries of diplomatic incidents and retaliatory massacres. The last recorded blood eagle wedding ceremony took place in Iceland around 1030 CE, when a chieftain named Thorkel performed the ritual on a captured Danish prince, triggering a war that lasted 15 years and devastated both kingdoms. As the victim finally succumbs to his injuries, his blood pooling around the altar stones, you can't help but think that even those Chinese foot-binding sessions are starting to look like spa treatments in comparison. That Viking blood eagle might have been spectacularly violent, but at least the victims were already enemies. Unlike Tudor England, where your own wedding guests were legally required to watch you consummate your marriage, turning your most intimate moment into a public performance with life or death consequences for the entire kingdom. You're lying in the royal bedchamber of Hampton Court Palace in 1509, wearing nothing but a thin linen shift, while a crowd of nobles, clergy, and court officials arrange themselves around your four-poster bed like spectators at a particularly awkward theater performance. Tonight is your wedding night to King Henry VIII, and according to Tudor law, your marriage isn't legally valid until witnesses can confirm that consummation has actually occurred. The pressure is absolutely crushing. Not only do you need to perform sexually in front of an audience, but the future of England literally depends on your ability to produce an heir. If you fail to conceive, or worse, if the witnesses determine that proper consummation didn't take place, your marriage can be annulled and you could face charges of fraud, treason, or witchcraft. The Archbishop of Canterbury stands at the foot of your bed, holding a ceremonial candle and preparing to offer prayers for fertility, while you and Henry attempt to create the next heir to the throne. Beside him, the Lord Chancellor takes notes on parchment, documenting every detail of the proceedings for the royal records. You can hear the scratch of his quill pen mixing with the whispered conversations of the assembled courtiers. Here's what makes this tradition particularly nightmarish. The witnesses aren't just passive observers. They're actively involved in ensuring the marriage is properly consummated. If Henry appears to be having difficulties, the court physicians are authorized to offer assistance, including herbal remedies, aphrodisiacs, and even physical manipulation to ensure successful penetration and ejaculation. The medical understanding of reproduction was primitive and terrifying. Tudor doctors believed that both partners needed to achieve orgasm simultaneously for conception to occur, so the witnesses would actually coach you through the process, offering advice on positioning, timing, and technique while you tried to maintain some shred of dignity. The political implications were staggering. Foreign ambassadors often attended royal consummations to report back to their own kingdoms about the likelihood of succession. Your sexual performance was literally a matter of international diplomacy, with the stability of alliances and trade agreements hanging in the balance. No pressure at all. Historians still argue whether these witness consummations were primarily about ensuring legitimacy or simply satisfying the voyeuristic tendencies of the nobility. but the psychological trauma inflicted on royal brides was undeniable. Many queens reported suffering from what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders and sexual dysfunction following their public defloration. The room fills with the scent of burning herbs, supposedly aphrodisiacs like mandrake root and powdered rhinoceros horn, while Henry approaches the bed with all the romantic subtlety of a man performing a state duty. The witnesses lean forward expectantly, some taking bets on how long the proceedings will take and whether you'll conceive on the first attempt. You close your eyes and try to pretend you're somewhere else, but the constant murmur of commentary makes it impossible to escape the reality of your situation. The Bishop of Winchester offers a running theological commentary on the sanctity of marriage, while the French ambassador whispers observations to his secretary about English royal customs. The physical examination afterward is almost worse than the act itself. The court physicians inspect both you and Henry for evidence of successful consummation, checking for blood, semen, and other bodily fluids that would prove the marriage was properly completed. They document their findings in explicit detail, creating permanent records that will be stored in the royal archives for posterity. But here's the truly horrifying part. If the witnesses determine that consummation didn't occur satisfactorily, you might be required to repeat the performance the following night, and the night after that, until everyone is satisfied that the marriage has been properly sealed. Some unfortunate brides endured weeks of public sexual performances before finally producing the evidence required by law. The social dynamics are incredibly complex. You're surrounded by people who hold your life in their hands, but you're also expected to achieve intimate pleasure while they watch and judge your every movement. The courtiers who seemed supportive tonight might testify against you tomorrow if political winds change, using intimate details of your sexual performance as weapons in court intrigue. The tradition extended beyond royalty to wealthy merchant families and nobility, though the scale was usually smaller. Even middle-class weddings often included a bedding ceremony, where friends and family would escort the newlyweds to their chamber and remain until they were confident that consummation had occurred. Privacy was a luxury that few couples could afford. The legal framework was surprisingly detailed. Canon law specified exactly what constituted valid consummation, including requirements for penetration, ejaculation, and mutual consent. Marriages could be annulled years later if witnesses came forward claiming that proper consummation never occurred, making your wedding night performance a potential legal liability for decades. As Henry finally approaches climax, the witnesses lean in closer, straining to observe the crucial moment that will determine whether your marriage is legally binding. The Archbishop raises his candle higher, casting dancing shadows across the assembled faces, while the court recorder prepares to document the exact time and manner of completion. You realize with growing horror that this intimate moment will be discussed, analyzed, and recorded for history, becoming part of the official record that future generations will study. Your most private experience is being transformed into a public spectacle, witnessed by dozens and documented for eternity. Remember that Blood Eagle ceremony? At least those victims only had to suffer once. Those Tudor witnesses might have been invasive, but at least they went home after the show, unlike in ancient India, where becoming a widow meant you were expected to throw yourself onto your husband's burning funeral pyre while still alive, turning your marriage vows into a literal death sentence that you'd fulfill in front of cheering crowds. You're standing beside a massive wooden pyre in 12th century Rajasthan, watching flames consume your husband's body while hundreds of villagers chant prayers and throw flower petals. The heat is already unbearable from 20 feet away, but according to the ancient practice of sati, you're about to walk directly into those flames and burn alive to prove your devotion as the perfect wife. The pressure from your in-laws is relentless. Your mother-in-law grips your arm with surprising strength for an elderly woman, whispering that your husband's soul cannot find peace until you join him in death. The village priest nods approvingly, explaining that your sacrifice will purify your family's karma for 7 generations and guarantee your reunion with your beloved in the afterlife. Here's what makes sati particularly twisted. It wasn't presented as punishment or murder, but as the ultimate expression of wifely love and religious devotion. Society convinced women that burning alive was not only their duty but their privilege, a chance to achieve instant sainthood and eternal glory. The alternative was a lifetime of social ostracism, poverty, and ritual humiliation as a cursed widow. The flames roar higher as attendants add ghee and sandalwood to intensify the fire. You can smell your husband's flesh cooking, a sickening sweet odor that makes your stomach churn, but the crowd interprets your pale complexion as spiritual transcendence rather than terror. Someone places a garland of marigolds around your neck, your funeral decoration. The social mechanics were brutally effective. Widows who refused sati were considered inauspicious and were banned from all religious ceremonies, family gatherings, and social events. They couldn't remarry, inherit property, or even eat certain foods. Their own children often rejected them, believing that their mother's refusal to die had cursed the entire family with bad luck. The economic incentives were equally sinister. Your death would prevent you from claiming any inheritance rights, keeping your husband's property within his family rather than passing to your relatives. Some historians suggest that sati became more common during periods of economic hardship, when families couldn't afford to support widows and found it convenient to encourage their voluntary suicide. You take a step toward the pyre, feeling the heat sear your face and arms. The crowd erupts in approving cheers, throwing more flowers and shouting religious slogans. A group of women begins singing devotional songs about famous satis who achieved legendary status through their fiery deaths, their names still celebrated centuries later as examples of perfect wifehood. Historians still argue whether most sati deaths were truly voluntary or the result of family coercion and social pressure, but contemporary accounts describe elaborate rituals designed to prevent women from changing their minds once the process began. Some were given opium or other drugs to dull their fear, while others were physically restrained or pushed into the flames if they hesitated. The religious justification was complex and contradictory. Hindu scriptures actually contain very few references to sati, and many scholars argue that the practice was more about social control than spiritual devotion. The British colonial administration eventually banned sati in 1829, but not before documenting hundreds of cases where women were clearly coerced or forced into the flames against their will. Your sari catches fire as you move closer to the pyre, the silk fabric igniting instantly and sending shooting pains up your legs. The crowd's cheering becomes deafening, drowning out your screams as the flames begin consuming your body. You try to step backward, but strong hands push you forward, your own family members ensuring that you complete your sacred duty. The physical agony is indescribable. Your skin blisters and peels away while you're still conscious, your hair ignites in a burst of flame, and your lungs fill with superheated air that sears your throat and chest. But the worst part is the realization that this torture could last for several minutes before shock and blood loss finally grant you unconsciousness. The crowd interprets your death throes as religious ecstasy, claiming to see divine light emanating from your burning body. Some witnesses later swear they heard celestial music or saw your soul ascending to heaven in the form of a golden bird. Your agony becomes their spiritual experience, your suffering transformed into their religious validation. The aftermath is equally disturbing. Your charred remains will be collected and distributed as sacred relics, with pieces of your bones and ashes sold to devotees who believe they carry miraculous powers. Your death site might become a shrine where other widows come to pray for the courage to follow your example. But here's the most twisted aspect of sati. The practice created a perverse incentive for husbands to die young, knowing that their wives' spectacular suicide would bring honor and prestige to their families. Some men reportedly took unnecessary risks in battle or business, secure in the knowledge that their widows would glorify their memory through self-immolation. The psychological preparation was elaborate and manipulative. Potential sadists were isolated from anyone who might discourage them, surrounded only by people who praised their decision and described the glorious afterlife awaiting them. They were often kept awake for days before the ceremony, making them more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of rational decision-making. As your consciousness fades and the flames consume what remains of your body, you can hear the crowd already discussing which of your husband's other relatives might be suitable candidates for the next sati ceremony. Your death has become entertainment, your sacrifice transformed into a social event that the community will remember and celebrate for generations. The British officials who witnessed these ceremonies described them as the most horrifying spectacles they had ever seen, worse than any battlefield carnage because of the celebratory atmosphere surrounding such deliberate cruelty. Even those Viking blood eagles were starting to look merciful by comparison. At least those victims were already enemies, not beloved family members. Remember those Chinese foot-binding sessions? Suddenly a lifetime of chronic pain seems preferable to a few minutes of being roasted alive. That sati ceremony might have been horrifically final, but at least it was over quickly, unlike Celtic hand-fasting rituals, where you literally had to slice open your hands and bind them together with your partner's bleeding wounds, creating a blood bond that could lead to infection, gangrene, and a slow, agonizing death from what was supposed to be a romantic gesture. You're standing in a misty Scottish glen in 400C, surrounded by druids chanting in ancient Gaelic while your betrothed holds out his palm, already dripping with fresh blood from the ceremonial knife. The Celtic tradition of blood hand-fasting requires you to cut deep enough into your hand to ensure a steady flow of crimson that will mingle with his, creating a literal blood bond that's supposed to last for eternity, or at least until sepsis sets in. The druid priest approaches with a bronze blade that's been blessed in sacred springs and sharpened on standing stones. He explains that your blood must flow freely for the binding to be effective, which means cutting through not just skin but the underlying tissue and possibly even small blood vessels. You're essentially performing surgery on yourself with primitive tools and zero understanding of infection control. Here's what makes this tradition particularly dangerous. The Celts believed that blood carried the essence of the soul, so mixing your blood with your partner's would literally merge your spirits into one being. The deeper the cuts and the more blood that flowed, the stronger the spiritual connection would become. Some couples carved so deeply that they severed tendons or damaged nerves, leaving them permanently disabled. The ceremonial knife is passed to you, its edge gleaming in the torchlight. Your hands are already shaking from fear and cold, making it nearly impossible to control the depth of the cut. The blade bites into your palm, sending shooting pains up your arm as blood wells up and begins dripping onto the sacred stones below. The binding process requires your bleeding hands to be tied together with leather cords or braided rope, ensuring that your wounds remain in direct contact for the entire ceremony. The pressure from the binding actually makes the bleeding worse, while the rough materials grind dirt and debris into your open cuts. It's like deliberately creating the perfect conditions for a life-threatening infection. Celtic society took these blood bonds incredibly seriously. Couples who underwent hand fasting were considered more deeply married than those who simply exchanged vows. The physical scars served as permanent reminders of their commitment, while the shared risk of death from infection was seen as proof of their willingness to sacrifice everything for love. Historians still argue whether blood hand fasting was primarily a religious ritual or a practical way to ensure that marriage contracts couldn't be easily broken, but the medical consequences were undeniably severe. Many couples died within days of their ceremony from infections that spread from their hands throughout their bodies, turning their wedding celebration into a double funeral. Your partner grips your bleeding hand tightly, his fingers intertwining with yours as the druid begins wrapping the leather cord around your joined wrists. The pain is excruciating, not just from the fresh cuts, but from the pressure of his grip forcing your wounds to gape open wider. Blood flows freely down both your arms, pooling at your feet and staining your ceremonial robes. The ritual continues for what feels like hours, with the druids chanting prayers to ancient gods while your hands remain bound together in an increasingly painful grip. The leather cord becomes slippery with blood, requiring periodic retightening that sends fresh waves of agony through your injured palms. You begin to feel lightheaded from blood loss, but fainting during the ceremony would be considered a terrible omen. The spiritual significance was deeply rooted in Celtic mythology, where blood sacrifice was believed to strengthen the connection between the mortal and divine realms. By offering your blood to the gods during your wedding ceremony, you were essentially asking for their blessing and protection over your marriage. The fact that you might die in the process was considered an acceptable risk for such divine favor. But here's the truly twisted part. If one partner died from infection following the hand fasting, the survivor was expected to carry a piece of their deceased spouse's flesh or bone as a permanent reminder of their blood bond. Some widows wore necklaces made from their husband's finger bones, while widowers kept dried pieces of their wife's heart in leather pouches around their necks. The cleanup after the ceremony was equally gruesome. The sacred stones would be permanently stained with blood, creating a lasting monument to your union that would remind future generations of the price you paid for love. Some hand-fasting sites became pilgrimage destinations where other couples would come to pray for the courage to undergo their own blood binding. The infection risk was compounded by Celtic hygiene practices, which were primitive even by ancient standards. The ceremonial knife was rarely cleaned between uses, meaning that you were essentially sharing blood-borne diseases with every couple who had used it before you. Hepatitis, tetanus, and various bacterial infections spread rapidly through communities that practiced regular blood hand fasting. As the ceremony finally concludes and the druids begin unwrapping your bound hands, you can see that your cuts have already begun to fester. The edges of your wounds are swollen and discolored, with red streaks beginning to creep up your forearms. early signs of the blood poisoning that will either kill you or leave you permanently disabled within the next few days. Your new spouse examines his own infected hand with growing concern, realizing that your romantic blood bond might have just sentenced both of you to death. The other wedding guests maintain their celebratory mood, but you notice several of them keeping their distance, unwilling to risk contamination from your infected wounds. The irony is crushing. A ritual designed to bind you together for eternity might actually ensure that your marriage lasts only a few days. As you stumble away from the ceremony site, your hands throbbing with infection and your vision blurring from blood loss, you can't help thinking that even those sooty widows had it easier. At least their suffering was over quickly. Remember that Tudor consummation ceremony? Suddenly having an audience doesn't seem quite so bad when the alternative is deliberately giving yourself gangrene in the name of true love. Those Celtic blood bonds might have risked gangrene, but at least you knew what you were getting into. Unlike feudal Japanese wedding ceremonies, where the ceremonial sake could be deliberately poisoned by rival families, turning your wedding toast into a deadly game of Russian roulette where one sip could mean instant death or agonizing organ failure. You're kneeling on tatami mats in a traditional Japanese home in 1185, watching as your future mother-in-law prepares the Sankudo ceremony, the ritual sharing of sake that will officially seal your marriage. 3 cups of rice wine sit before you, each one potentially containing enough poison to kill a horse, while your new family smiles serenely and pretends this is just another lovely wedding tradition. The political landscape of medieval Japan was a minefield of clan rivalries, territorial disputes, and succession wars, making every marriage a potential target for assassination. Your wedding wasn't just a romantic celebration. It was a merger of military alliances, and there were plenty of people who would benefit from seeing you dead before the ceremony concluded. The sake preparation ritual is elaborate and seemingly innocent. The rice wine is heated in ceremonial bronze vessels, mixed with herbs and spices, and served in lacquered cups that have been blessed by Shinto priests. But hidden among those traditional ingredients could be any number of deadly substances, from arsenic and mercury to exotic plant toxins that would kill you slowly and painfully over the course of several days. Here's what makes this tradition particularly terrifying. The poisoning attempts weren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned political assassinations disguised as wedding accidents. Rival clans would spend months infiltrating the bride's household, bribing servants, and identifying opportunities to introduce toxins into the ceremonial sake without detection. The first cup is placed before you, its surface reflecting the flickering candlelight like a mirror of liquid death. You're expected to drink deeply and with obvious pleasure, showing respect for your new family and enthusiasm for the marriage. Hesitation or reluctance would be interpreted as an insult that could trigger a blood feud lasting generations. Your hands tremble slightly as you lift the cup to your lips, trying to detect any unusual odor or taste that might indicate poison. The sake is warm and slightly sweet, with an underlying bitterness that could be from the rice fermentation process, or from the arsenic that's slowly dissolving in your stomach. There's no way to know until symptoms begin appearing hours later. The ceremony requires you to take 3 sips from each of 3 cups, with your groom following the same pattern. If the sake is poisoned, both of you will likely die together, which some assassins considered poetic justice. Other times, only 1 cup would be contaminated, creating a twisted lottery where marriage became a game of chance with death as the ultimate prize. Historians still argue whether sake poisoning was a common occurrence, or simply a paranoid fear that developed during particularly violent periods of Japanese history. But documented cases exist of entire wedding parties being wiped out by contaminated ceremonial wine. The Genpei War period was especially notorious for such incidents, with rival Taira and Minamoto clans regularly attempting to eliminate each other through wedding assassinations. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning begin subtly: a slight burning sensation in your throat, mild nausea that you initially attribute to wedding nerves, and a metallic taste that lingers long after you've finished drinking. By the time you realize something is wrong, the toxin has already been absorbed into your bloodstream and is beginning its deadly work on your organs. The social dynamics are incredibly complex. You're surrounded by people who claim to love and welcome you, but any one of them could be your murderer. The servant who prepared the sake, the priest who blessed it, even your new husband could be part of a conspiracy to eliminate you before you can produce heirs or influence family politics. The second cup is presented with great ceremony, accompanied by prayers for fertility and prosperity. You notice that your groom's face has taken on a slightly grayish pallor, and he's sweating despite the cool evening air. Either he's nervous about the marriage, or the first cup contained enough poison to begin affecting his system. You'll know which within the next few hours. The medical knowledge of the time made poisoning detection nearly impossible. Symptoms of arsenic, mercury, or plant toxins were often attributed to evil spirits, dietary imbalances, or divine punishment for moral failings. Even if you suspected poisoning, there were no antidotes or treatments available that could save your life once the toxins began their work. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. Some families deliberately used mildly toxic substances in their ceremonial sake as a test of their new daughter-in-law's constitution and loyalty. If you survived the wedding ceremony, it proved you were strong enough to bear healthy children, and devoted enough to risk death for the family honor. The third and final cup arrives, and you can see your reflection in the dark liquid, pale, frightened, and possibly about to drink your own death. The assembled guests watch expectantly as you raise the cup in a final toast to your new life, which may be measured in hours rather than years. Your stomach begins cramping violently as you set down the empty cup, and you taste blood in your mouth. Classic signs of heavy metal poisoning that indicate your organs are already beginning to shut down. The wedding celebration continues around you, but you're fighting waves of nausea and dizziness that make it difficult to remain upright. The irony is devastating. You've just participated in a beautiful ceremony celebrating love and new beginnings, but you may have simultaneously signed your own death warrant. The same ritual that was supposed to bind you to your new family might have just ensured that you'll never live to see your first anniversary. As the evening progresses and the poison continues its work, you realize that this wedding tradition makes all the previous horrors seem almost quaint by comparison. At least those Celtic blood bonds gave you a fighting chance against infection, and even the Sooty widows knew what they were facing. Here, you've been murdered by people who smiled while they did it, killed by the very ceremony that was supposed to celebrate your happiness. Remember that Viking blood eagle? Suddenly being the victim instead of the witness doesn't seem quite so bad when the alternative is being slowly poisoned by your own wedding cake. That Japanese sake poisoning might have been sneaky and underhanded, but at least it was over relatively quickly, unlike the African lip plate stretching tradition, where young girls spend years gradually tearing their mouths apart with increasingly larger wooden discs. creating grotesque facial deformities that made eating, speaking, and even breathing a constant struggle for the rest of their lives. You're sitting in an Ethiopian village in the 16th century, watching as the tribal elder approaches your 12-year-old daughter with a sharp bone awl and the smallest wooden disc in a series that will eventually stretch her lower lip to the size of a dinner plate. The Mercy and Suri tribes consider this mutilation the ultimate symbol of feminine beauty and marriageability. But you're about to witness a process that makes medieval torture devices look like children's toys. The initial piercing is performed without any anesthesia or sterilization. The elder simply drives the bone all through your daughter's lower lip, while she screams and blood pours down her chin. The first wooden disc, about the size of a coin, is immediately inserted into the fresh wound to prevent it from healing closed. The pain is excruciating, but this is just the beginning of a years-long process that will systematically destroy her ability to eat, speak, or live normally. Here's what makes this tradition particularly horrific. The lip-stretching process requires constant, gradual expansion over several years, with larger and larger plates being inserted every few months. Each new disc tears the existing wound wider, creating fresh trauma and increasing the risk of infection, nerve damage, and permanent disfigurement. The cultural pressure is immense. Girls who refuse lip plate insertion are considered unmarriageable and are often ostracized from their communities. The size of a woman's lip plate directly correlates to her bride price, with the largest plates commanding the highest dowries. Your daughter's mouth is literally being transformed into a commodity that will determine her family's economic future. The daily maintenance is a nightmare of pain and hygiene challenges. The wooden plates must be removed regularly for cleaning, revealing gaping wounds that never fully heal. Food particles and bacteria collect in the stretched tissue, causing chronic infections that can lead to sepsis or gangrene. Many girls die from complications related to their lip modifications long before they reach marriageable age. Your daughter tries to speak, but the wooden disc makes normal speech impossible. She's developed a lisp and slur that will only worsen as larger plates are inserted, eventually making her nearly incomprehensible to anyone outside her immediate family. The simple act of communication has been sacrificed on the altar of cultural beauty standards. Historians still argue whether lip plate traditions originated as protection against slave raiders, the theory being that disfigured women would be less likely to be captured and sold, or as purely aesthetic modifications designed to enhance feminine beauty. But the physical consequences were undeniably devastating regardless of the original motivation. The eating process becomes increasingly difficult as the lip plates grow larger. Your daughter must remove the disc before every meal, revealing a gaping hole in her face that makes chewing and swallowing nearly impossible. Food constantly falls out of her mouth, and she's lost significant weight because consuming adequate nutrition has become a daily struggle. The social dynamics are complex and cruel. Women with the largest lip plates are revered as the most beautiful and desirable, but they're also the most disabled and dependent on others for basic survival. The very modification that makes them valuable as brides also makes them incapable of functioning independently. The infection risk is constant and severe. The wooden plates are rarely properly sterilized, and the open wounds provide perfect breeding grounds for bacteria. You've watched several girls in your village die from infections that started in their lip modifications and spread throughout their bodies, turning their pursuit of beauty into a death sentence. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. If a girl's lip plate falls out or breaks, and the wound begins to heal closed, she's considered damaged goods and becomes completely unmarriageable. The years of pain and disfigurement become worthless if she can't maintain the modification, leaving her trapped between the agony of keeping the plate and the social death of removing it. The psychological impact is devastating. Your daughter has been taught that her natural face is ugly and unacceptable, that love and marriage require her to mutilate herself beyond recognition. She's internalized the belief that her worth as a woman depends entirely on her willingness to endure constant pain and disability. The larger plates create additional problems. They're heavy enough to cause neck strain and headaches, and they make sleeping nearly impossible. Your daughter has developed chronic insomnia because lying down causes the plate to pull painfully on her stretched lip tissue. She's essentially been condemned to a lifetime of discomfort for the sake of cultural beauty standards. The dental consequences are equally severe. The constant pressure from the lip plates gradually pushes the lower teeth outward, creating a protruding jaw and malocclusion that makes chewing even more difficult. Many women lose their lower teeth entirely, further complicating their ability to eat and speak normally. As your daughter's lip plate is upgraded to the next size, you watch her face contort in agony as the elder forces the larger disc through her partially healed tissue. Fresh blood flows down her chin, and you can see new tears forming in the stretched skin. She's only 13 years old, but she looks like she's aged decades from the constant pain and stress. The irony is crushing. This tradition designed to make women more attractive actually makes them less capable of the basic functions that define human existence. They can't eat properly, speak clearly, or even smile without revealing the grotesque modifications that supposedly enhance their beauty. The economic implications are staggering. Families invest years of resources and emotional energy into their daughters' lip modifications, only to watch many of them die from complications before they can be married off. It's a brutal lottery where the stakes are measured in human lives rather than money. As you watch your daughter struggle to adjust to her new, larger plate, you can't help but think that even those Japanese sake poisoning victims had it easier. At least their suffering had a definite endpoint, while your daughter faces decades of daily agony in pursuit of an impossible beauty standard. Remember that Celtic blood hand-fasting ceremony? Suddenly the risk of infection seems almost trivial compared to deliberately destroying your child's face in the name of tradition. Those African lip plates might have been permanently disfiguring, but at least the modification process was gradual. Unlike Russian banya wedding purification rituals, where brides were stripped naked and beaten with birch branches until their skin was raw and bleeding, all while being roasted alive in superheated steam chambers that could cause heat stroke, dehydration, and cardiac arrest within minutes. You're standing outside a traditional Russian bathhouse in 1650, listening to the screams echoing from within as your wedding party prepares you for marriage through a purification ritual that makes medieval torture chambers look like luxury spas. The banya ceremony requires you to endure temperatures exceeding 200 degrees Fahrenheit, while being systematically whipped with wet birch branches until your entire body is covered in welts and lacerations. The cultural justification is deeply rooted in Slavic folklore. The intense heat and ritualistic beating are supposed to drive out evil spirits, purify your soul, and prepare your body for the sacred act of procreation. But what you're actually experiencing is a form of sanctioned torture that regularly killed brides through heat exhaustion, dehydration, and shock from the combined trauma of extreme temperature and physical abuse. Your mother-in-law leads the ceremony, wielding a bundle of birch twigs called a vennik that's been soaked in scalding water to make the branches more flexible and painful. She explains that the harder she beats you, the more fertile and obedient you'll become as a wife. The logic is charmingly circular. If you survive the beating, you're strong enough for marriage. If you die, you were obviously too weak to be a good wife anyway. Here's what makes this tradition particularly dangerous. The combination of extreme heat and physical trauma creates a perfect storm of medical emergencies. Your body is already struggling to regulate its temperature in the superheated environment, and the additional stress of being repeatedly struck pushes your cardiovascular system beyond its limits. The banya itself is a wooden chamber heated by stones that glow red-hot from the fire beneath them. Water is periodically thrown onto the stones, creating clouds of steam so dense you can barely see your own hands. The humidity approaches 100%, making every breath feel like you're drowning in hot soup while your skin literally begins to cook from the outside in. The beating begins with light taps across your shoulders and back, but quickly escalates to full-force strikes that leave bloody welts across your entire body. The wet birch branches act like tiny whips, each twig creating its own line of pain as they slash across your overheated skin. The combination of heat and trauma causes your blood vessels to dilate dramatically, leading to dangerous drops in blood pressure. Russian folklore claims that the spirits of fertility live in the birch trees, and that transferring their essence to your body through ritualistic beating will guarantee successful pregnancies and healthy children. The more you bleed during the ceremony, the more blessed your future offspring will supposedly be. It's essentially a fertility cult that worships childbearing through systematic abuse. Historians still argue whether banya purification was primarily a religious ritual or a practical way to test a bride's physical endurance before marriage, but the medical consequences were undeniably severe. Many women died during the ceremony from heat stroke, cardiac arrest, or shock from blood loss, while others survived but suffered permanent damage to their cardiovascular and nervous systems. The temperature continues to rise as more water is thrown onto the glowing stones, and you feel your consciousness beginning to fade as your body struggles to cope with the extreme conditions. Your skin has turned bright red from the heat and beating, and you're losing fluids so rapidly through sweating that dehydration becomes a serious threat within minutes. The social pressure to endure the full ceremony is immense. Showing weakness or begging for mercy would bring shame upon your entire family, and could result in the marriage being called off. You're expected to smile and thank your tormentors for the privilege of being purified, even as your body approaches the limits of human endurance. The beating intensifies as the ceremony reaches its climax, with multiple women taking turns striking you with their birch bundles while chanting prayers for fertility and obedience. The pain becomes so overwhelming that your nervous system begins shutting down, creating a strange dissociation where you can observe your own torture from outside your body. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. If you fainted or collapsed during the banya ceremony, it was considered a sign that you were possessed by demons and required additional purification. Instead of receiving medical attention, unconscious brides were often subjected to even more extreme heat and beating until they either revived or died from the additional trauma. The aftermath is almost as dangerous as the ceremony itself. Your severely overheated body must be gradually cooled down to prevent shock. But the traditional method involves rolling naked in snow or plunging into ice-cold water. The sudden temperature change can cause your blood vessels to constrict so rapidly that your heart stops beating entirely. The infection risk from the numerous cuts and welts covering your body is compounded by the unsanitary conditions in most banyas, where multiple women share the same birch branches and the wooden surfaces harbor bacteria and fungi. Many brides who survived the initial ceremony died days later from sepsis caused by infected wounds. Your vision blurs as the final round of beating concludes, and you can barely stand upright as the women help you stumble out of the superheated chamber. Your skin is covered in a network of bloody welts that will take weeks to heal, assuming infection doesn't set in first. The purification ritual has left you looking like a torture victim rather than a blushing bride. The irony is staggering. A ceremony designed to prepare you for the joys of marriage has instead subjected you to trauma that will likely affect your physical and psychological health for years to come. The same ritual that's supposed to ensure fertility might have just damaged your reproductive system through extreme heat exposure and physical abuse. As you collapse onto a wooden bench outside the banya, your body shaking from shock and exhaustion, you realize that this tradition makes all the previous horrors seem almost reasonable by comparison. At least those lip plate modifications serve some cultural purpose, while this appears to be nothing more than sanctified sadism disguised as spiritual preparation. Remember that Japanese sake poisoning? Suddenly the possibility of a quick death seems preferable to surviving this ritualistic torture session that masquerades as wedding preparation. Those Russian banya beatings might have been brutally painful, but at least they were over in a few hours, unlike Aztec wedding ceremonies, where human sacrifice was considered essential for divine blessing, meaning your romantic celebration required watching captive warriors have their still-beating hearts carved out of their chests while they screamed in agony and their blood splattered across your wedding altar. You're standing atop the great temple of Tenochtitlan in 1487, wearing elaborate feathered robes and jade jewelry while Aztec priests prepare to sacrifice a dozen captured Tlaxcalan warriors in honor of your marriage to a noble's son. The ceremony requires fresh human blood to appease Zakiquetzal, the goddess of love and fertility, and the more spectacular the deaths, the more blessed your union will supposedly become. The first victim is dragged to the obsidian altar, his arms and legs held by 4 priests while the high priest raises a razor-sharp flint knife above his chest. The man's eyes are wide with terror as he realizes what's about to happen, but his screams are drowned out by the thunderous chanting of hundreds of wedding guests who've gathered to witness this sacred butchery. Here's what makes Aztec wedding sacrifices particularly horrifying. The priests were trained to keep victims alive and conscious for as long as possible during the heart extraction process. They would make precise incisions between the ribs, carefully avoiding major blood vessels until the final moment, when they reached in and tore out the still-beating heart with their bare hands. The cultural logic was deeply rooted in Aztec cosmology. Human blood was considered the most precious offering to the gods, and wedding ceremonies represented the creation of new life that required divine approval. The more valuable the sacrifice, captured enemy warriors were preferred over slaves or commoners, the greater the blessing bestowed upon the newlyweds. The priest's knife slices through skin and muscle with surgical precision, creating an opening just large enough for his hand to reach inside the victim's chest cavity. You can hear the wet, tearing sounds as he works his fingers around the heart, feeling for the major arteries that need to be severed. The warrior's body convulses violently, but he remains conscious throughout the entire procedure. The moment of heart extraction is accompanied by an explosion of blood that sprays across the altar, the priests, and the front rows of wedding guests. The victim's eyes roll back as his heart is held aloft, still pumping blood in the priest's grip, while his body continues to twitch and spasm on the stone platform. The whole process takes several minutes of unimaginable agony. Your new husband steps forward to receive the blessing, allowing the priest to smear the victim's blood across his forehead and cheeks while offering prayers for fertility and prosperity. You're next in line for this grisly baptism, trying not to vomit as warm blood is painted across your face and the metallic smell fills your nostrils. Historians still argue whether Aztec human sacrifice was primarily religious devotion or political theater designed to terrorize enemies, but the scale was undeniably massive. Some wedding ceremonies involved dozens of sacrificial victims, with the celebration lasting for days as prisoners were systematically tortured to death in increasingly creative ways. The second victim is a young warrior, probably no older than 16, who struggles desperately against his captors as he's forced onto the blood-soaked altar. His youth makes the sacrifice even more valuable to the gods, according to Aztec theology, because his life force is at its peak potency. The priest takes extra care with this extraction, prolonging the agony to maximize the spiritual benefit. The crowd erupts in cheers as the teenager's heart is torn from his chest, his blood adding to the growing pool that's already ankle-deep around the altar. Some wedding guests dip their fingers in the crimson liquid and paint ritual symbols on their own faces, participating in the sacred violence that's supposed to bless your marriage. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. The sacrificial victims were often prisoners who had been captured specifically for wedding ceremonies, meaning their torture and death was planned months in advance. Families would request specific types of victims: young warriors for fertility, enemy nobles for prestige, or captured priests for spiritual power. The psychological impact on the newlyweds must have been immense. You're literally beginning your married life by watching multiple people die in the most agonizing way possible. The association between love and violence, between celebration and death, creates a cognitive dissonance that probably haunted couples for years. The third victim tries to break free from his captors, managing to roll off the altar and stumble several steps before being tackled by temple guards. His desperate attempt at escape only adds to the excitement of the crowd, who cheer louder as he's dragged back to face his inevitable death. The priest seems annoyed by the delay and makes the heart extraction even more brutal as punishment. The religious justification was complex and all-encompassing. Aztec mythology taught that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, so humans owed them a constant debt of blood and death. Wedding ceremonies were seen as particularly important occasions for repaying this debt, since marriage represented the continuation of human life that the gods had made possible. The altar is now completely covered in blood, creating a slippery surface that makes it difficult for the priests to maintain their footing. The metallic smell is overwhelming, and several wedding guests have fainted from the combination of gore and the intense heat radiating from the temple's stone surfaces. As the ceremony continues with victim after victim, you begin to realize that this tradition makes all the previous horrors seem almost civilized by comparison. At least those Russian banya beatings were inflicted on the actual bride, while this requires you to celebrate your love by watching innocent people die in the most brutal way imaginable. The irony is devastating. A ceremony designed to ensure happiness and fertility is built on a foundation of torture and murder. Your wedding day will forever be associated with the screams of dying men and the sight of their hearts being ripped from their chests while they were still alive. The final victim is the most prestigious, a captured Tlaxcalan noble whose death will supposedly guarantee that your marriage produces sons worthy of becoming warriors themselves. His execution is the most elaborate, with the priest taking nearly 10 minutes to slowly carve out his heart while he remains conscious and screaming. As the ceremony finally concludes and the last heart is offered to the gods, you look out over the blood-soaked altar and realize that your wedding celebration has just claimed more lives than some medieval battles. The price of divine blessing has been paid in human agony, and you'll carry the memory of those dying screams with you for the rest of your married life. Remember that African lip plate stretching? Suddenly years of facial disfigurement seem preferable to starting your marriage with a mass murder disguised as a religious ceremony. Those Aztec heart sacrifices might have been spectacularly bloody, but at least the victims were enemy prisoners, unlike European chivalry traditions, where your own neighbors would form violent mobs to punish inappropriate marriages, subjecting newlyweds to ritualized humiliation, physical assault, and sometimes death if the community disapproved of their union for any reason, from age differences to social class mismatches. You're cowering in your cottage in 14th century France as hundreds of villagers surround your home, banging pots and pans, blowing horns, and shouting obscenities because you dared to marry a man 20 years your senior. The chivalry mob has decided that your marriage violates community standards, and they're here to deliver rough justice that could range from public humiliation to actual murder, depending on how angry they've worked themselves up. The tradition of chivalry, literally meaning rough music, was a form of vigilante justice where communities took it upon themselves to punish marriages they deemed socially unacceptable. Age gaps, class differences, remarriage after widowhood, or even marrying someone from a neighboring village could trigger these violent mob actions that terrorized newlyweds for days or weeks. The cacophony outside your door is deafening. Hundreds of people beating metal objects, playing discordant music, and chanting rhymes that mock your marriage in increasingly crude terms. But this isn't just noise harassment. It's the prelude to physical violence that could escalate to property destruction, assault, or even lynching if the mob decides your transgression is serious enough. Here's what makes chivalry particularly terrifying. These weren't random acts of violence, but organized community events with their own rules, rituals, and escalation patterns. The mobs often included respected citizens, local officials, and even clergy members who saw themselves as defenders of social order rather than violent criminals. Your husband tries to barricade the door as the crowd grows larger and more aggressive. Someone throws a rock through your window, sending glass shards across the floor, while others begin chanting demands for you to come outside and face justice. The mob mentality is building towards something much more dangerous than simple harassment. The social dynamics are complex and cruel. People who smiled at your wedding last week are now part of a howling mob calling for your punishment. Neighbors who borrowed tools from your husband are now throwing stones at your house. The same community that should protect you has turned into your greatest threat. The chivalry tradition served multiple social functions. It reinforced community standards about appropriate marriages, provided an outlet for class resentment and sexual jealousy, and allowed ordinary people to exercise power over their social superiors through collective action. Your personal happiness has become a threat to the established order that must be violently suppressed. Historians still argue whether chivalry was primarily about maintaining social stability or simply gave communities an excuse for sanctioned violence and mob rule. But the psychological and physical damage inflicted on victims was undeniably severe. Many couples fled their homes permanently, while others suffered injuries or property damage that ruined them financially. The noise outside reaches a crescendo as someone begins organizing the crowd into more focused action. You can hear them discussing specific punishments, perhaps forcing you to ride backwards on a donkey through the village while being pelted with rotten food, or making your husband wear women's clothing while being paraded through the streets. But the entertainment can quickly turn deadly. Some chivalry mobs escalated to arson, burning down the offending couple's home with them inside. Others involved ritualized beatings that left victims permanently disabled or dead. The line between community justice and murder was often crossed in the heat of mob excitement. The religious authorities were often complicit in these attacks, viewing chivalry as a way to enforce moral standards without official church involvement. Priests would sometimes participate in the mobs or provide theological justification for the violence, claiming that God approved of community punishment for sinful marriages. Your front door begins to splinter under the assault of makeshift battering rams as the mob decides that noise harassment isn't sufficient punishment for your crimes. The faces you can see through the broken windows are twisted with rage and excitement. Your neighbors are enjoying your terror, feeding off the collective violence like participants in some ancient blood sport. The legal system offered little protection from chivalry mobs, since local authorities often participated in or sympathized with the community action. Victims who tried to seek justice through official channels frequently found that magistrates and constables had been part of the mob that attacked them. The economic consequences were devastating. Even if you survived the immediate violence, the social ostracism that followed could destroy your livelihood. Customers would boycott your business, landlords would evict you, and employers would refuse to hire you. This chivalry marked you as a community outcast whose very presence was considered offensive. Someone in the crowd shouts that they brought tar and feathers, a punishment that involves stripping victims naked, covering them with hot tar, and then rolling them in feathers before parading them through town. The tar burns the skin and can cause permanent scarring, while the public humiliation often leads to psychological trauma that lasts for years. The mob's psychology is fascinating and terrifying. Individually, most of these people would never consider committing violent crimes, but as part of a crowd, they're capable of acts of shocking brutality. The anonymity of the mob allows ordinary citizens to indulge their darkest impulses while feeling morally justified. Your husband grabs a kitchen knife as the door finally gives way and angry villagers pour into your home. The chivalry has escalated from harassment to home invasion, and there's no telling how far the violence will go. Some mobs were satisfied with property destruction and humiliation, while others didn't stop until their victims were dead. The irony is crushing. A tradition supposedly designed to protect community values has turned your neighbors into a murderous mob that threatens the very social fabric it claims to defend. The same people who attend church every Sunday and preach about Christian charity are now baying for your blood because you married someone they disapprove of. As the mob surges into your home, overturning furniture and smashing your possessions, you realize that this tradition makes all the previous horrors seem almost reasonable by comparison. At least those Aztec sacrifices served a religious purpose. While this appears to be nothing more than sanctified bullying that gives communities an excuse to torture anyone who doesn't conform to their arbitrary standards. The violence escalates as more people crowd into your small cottage, their faces illuminated by torchlight and twisted with mob fury. Your wedding celebration has become a nightmare of community-sanctioned terrorism that could end with your death. All because you chose to marry someone your neighbors didn't approve of. Remember that Russian Banya beating? Suddenly being tortured by your in-laws seems preferable to being murdered by your own community for the crime of falling in love with the wrong person. Those European chivalry mobs might have been terrifyingly unpredictable, but at least their violence was somewhat random. Unlike Polynesian shark-tooth scarification ceremonies, where brides were deliberately carved with razor-sharp teeth in precise patterns across their entire bodies, creating permanent wedding tattoos through a process so agonizing that many women died from shock, blood loss, or infections before their honeymoon even began. You're lying face down on a woven mat in a traditional Samoan fail in 1650, surrounded by tribal elders who are preparing to mark your body with intricate designs using freshly extracted tiger shark teeth. The PA's ceremony requires every inch of your torso, arms, and legs to be carved with traditional patterns that will identify you as a married woman for the rest of your life, assuming you survive the next several days of systematic torture. The cultural significance is deeply rooted in Polynesian spirituality. The scars aren't just decorative, but serve as spiritual armor that protects married women from evil spirits and ensures fertility. The more elaborate and extensive the scarification, the more powerful the protection, which means your entire body will be transformed into a canvas of permanent wounds that may never fully heal. The master tattooist approaches with a comb-like tool embedded with shark teeth that have been sharpened to surgical precision. Each tooth is capable of cutting through skin, muscle, and even bone if applied with sufficient pressure. The implement looks more like a medieval torture device than an artistic tool, and you're about to experience firsthand why this ceremony has such a high mortality rate. Here's what makes Polynesian scarification particularly brutal. The process requires multiple sessions over several weeks, with new areas being carved while previous wounds are still healing. Your body becomes a patchwork of fresh cuts, infected scabs, and partially healed scars that create a constant state of pain and vulnerability to life-threatening complications. The first cuts are made across your shoulders, the shark teeth biting deep into your flesh as the tattooist works the traditional patterns into your skin. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. Imagine being systematically sliced with broken glass while someone rubs salt into every wound. Blood flows freely down your back, pooling beneath you on the woven mat. The social pressure to complete the full ceremony is immense. Women who fail to finish their scarification are considered incomplete and may be rejected by their husbands or ostracized by their communities. The scars serve as proof of your courage, endurance, and commitment to traditional values, making them essential for social acceptance. The tattooist works methodically, creating geometric patterns that tell the story of your family lineage, spiritual beliefs, and marital status. Each design has specific meaning, and mistakes can't be corrected. If the scarification goes wrong, you're permanently marked with symbols that might identify you as cursed, unfaithful, or spiritually contaminated. Historians still argue whether Polynesian scarification was primarily artistic expression or practical identification system, but the medical consequences were undeniably severe. The combination of extensive tissue damage, primitive hygiene conditions, and lack of medical knowledge created perfect conditions for fatal infections, blood poisoning, and shock. The shark teeth tear through your skin with each stroke, creating wounds that are simultaneously too deep and too jagged to heal properly. Unlike modern tattoo needles that create tiny punctures, these teeth leave gaping cuts that require weeks to close and often result in raised, keloid scars that remain painful for years. The infection risk is compounded by the tropical climate and unsanitary conditions. The same shark teeth are used on multiple people without sterilization. Blood-borne diseases spread rapidly through communities, and the open wounds provide perfect breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites that thrive in the humid environment. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. If you died during the scarification process, it was considered a sign that you were spiritually unworthy of marriage, and your death would bring shame upon your entire family. The ceremony that was supposed to prepare you for married life could literally kill you, and your death would be interpreted as divine judgment rather than medical tragedy. The pain becomes so overwhelming that your nervous system begins shutting down, creating a dissociative state where you can observe your own torture from outside your body. This psychological defense mechanism is common in extreme trauma situations, but it also makes it difficult to assess the severity of your injuries or communicate your distress to the tattooists. The second session begins before your first wounds have fully healed, with new cuts being made adjacent to areas that are still infected and inflamed. The combination of fresh trauma and existing wounds creates a cascade of complications that pushes your immune system beyond its limits. Your body temperature spikes as infection sets in, and you begin experiencing the delirium and confusion that indicate blood poisoning. The tribal healers interpret these symptoms as spiritual possession rather than medical emergency, treating your fever with additional scarification designed to drive out the evil spirits they believe are causing your illness. The social dynamics are incredibly complex. You're surrounded by people who claim to love and honor you, but they're systematically destroying your body in the name of tradition. The same ceremony that's supposed to celebrate your marriage is inflicting trauma that will affect your physical and psychological health for the rest of your life. The scarification continues for weeks, with each session adding new layers of pain and infection to your already compromised body. The patterns grow more elaborate and extensive, covering areas that make basic functions like sitting, walking, or sleeping nearly impossible without constant agony. The final session involves scarification of your face and neck, areas where infection is most likely to be fatal due to proximity to your brain and major blood vessels. The shark teeth carve delicate patterns around your eyes and mouth, creating wounds that could blind you or cause facial paralysis if they heal improperly. As the ceremony finally concludes, you're left with a body covered in hundreds of infected wounds that may take months to heal, if they heal at all. Many women developed chronic infections that required ongoing treatment, while others suffered permanent nerve damage that left them partially paralyzed or in constant pain. The irony is staggering. A tradition designed to make you more beautiful and spiritually protected has instead left you disfigured and disabled. The same ceremony that was supposed to prepare you for the joys of marriage has inflicted trauma that will likely affect your ability to bear children, perform household duties, or even enjoy physical intimacy with your husband. The psychological impact is equally devastating. You've been taught that your natural body was inadequate and required extensive modification to be acceptable for marriage. The months of pain and disfigurement have created associations between love and suffering that will probably haunt your relationship for years. As you lie on your mat, covered in infected wounds and burning with fever, you realize that this tradition makes all the previous horrors seem almost merciful by comparison. At least those chivalry mobs were trying to punish behavior they disapproved of, while this appears to be nothing more than ritualized torture disguised as artistic expression. Remember that Aztec heart sacrifice ceremony? Suddenly watching other people die seems preferable to having your own body systematically destroyed in the name of marital preparation. Those Polynesian shark tooth scars might have been permanently disfiguring, but at least they were inflicted by trained specialists, unlike Germanic trial by combat traditions, where prospective grooms had to fight to the death against the bride's male relatives or rival suitors, turning wedding proposals into literal battlefields where love was proven through your ability to kill other human beings with swords, axes, and bare hands. You're standing in a muddy field outside a Saxon village in 890 CE, gripping a battle-worn sword while your beloved's 3 brothers circle you like wolves, each one determined to prove that you're unworthy of their sister by splitting your skull open with their war hammers. The Germanic tradition of Brautkampf, bride combat, requires you to defeat every male challenger in mortal combat before you can claim your intended wife, and losing means death rather than simply finding another girlfriend. The cultural logic is brutally straightforward. If you can't protect yourself in single combat, how can you be trusted to protect a wife and children from raiders, wild animals, or enemy warriors? Marriage isn't just a romantic union but a military alliance, and your bride's family needs proof that you're capable of violence before they'll entrust their daughter to your care. Your first opponent approaches with a massive 2-handed axe that could cleave you in half with a single blow. He's your beloved's eldest brother, a veteran warrior whose scarred arms tell stories of dozens of previous battles. The fact that he's trying to kill you doesn't seem to diminish his affection for you as a potential brother-in-law. This is just business, and if you survive, you'll probably share drinks and war stories afterward. Here's what makes trial by combat particularly terrifying. These aren't ceremonial duels with safety rules and referees, but actual fights to the death where any weapon or tactic is acceptable. Eye gouging, groin strikes, and deliberate maiming are all considered legitimate techniques for proving your worthiness as a husband. The axe whistles past your head as you dodge the first attack, feeling the wind from the blade ruffle your hair. Your opponent's follow-up swing catches your shield, sending splinters of wood flying and nearly breaking your arm from the impact. The crowd of wedding guests cheers enthusiastically. Apparently watching potential grooms get butchered is considered excellent entertainment. The social dynamics are fascinatingly twisted. Your bride-to-be is watching from the sidelines, cheering for you to survive while simultaneously hoping her brothers don't get killed defending her honor. If you're too successful in combat, you might end up marrying into a family that resents you for murdering their sons. If you're not successful enough, well, you'll be too dead to worry about family dynamics. Your sword finds its mark in your opponent's thigh, drawing first blood and earning approving shouts from the spectators. But Germanic combat traditions often required you to kill or permanently disable your challengers. Wounding them might not be sufficient to prove your worthiness, especially if they're still capable of fighting. Historians still argue whether trial by combat was primarily about testing martial prowess or simply provided legal cover for settling personal grudges through sanctioned murder. but the mortality rate was undeniably high. Many prospective grooms died during these ceremonies, while others survived but were too injured to consummate their marriages or provide for their families. The second brother enters the combat circle, wielding a seeks, a long knife designed for close-quarters fighting where skill matters more than brute strength. He's younger and faster than his older brother, dancing around your sword strikes while looking for opportunities to slip his blade between your ribs. The psychological pressure is immense. You're not just fighting for your life, but for your entire future. Losing means death, but winning might require you to kill men who could become your beloved family members. The emotional complexity of trying to murder your future in-laws while proving your love for their daughter creates a cognitive dissonance that probably haunted survivors for years. The knife fighter manages to slip past your guard, his seeks opening a long gash across your ribs that sends blood streaming down your side. The wound isn't immediately fatal, but it's weakening you and making your movements slower and less precise. Time is now working against you as blood loss reduces your strength and coordination. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. If you killed all the male challengers, you might find yourself married into a family that now consisted entirely of widows and orphans who blamed you for their losses. Your wedding celebration could become a funeral wake, and your honeymoon might be spent consoling your new wife as she mourned the brothers you just slaughtered. The combat continues with increasing desperation as both fighters realize that only one of them will leave the circle alive. The crowd's cheering becomes more frenzied as blood flows more freely, turning your romantic gesture into a gladiatorial spectacle that entertains the entire community. Your sword finally finds the second brother's heart, piercing through his leather armor and ending his life with a wet, sucking sound that you'll probably hear in your nightmares for years to come. The crowd erupts in celebration, but you notice your bride-to-be weeping as she watches her brother die for the sake of your marriage. The third and final challenger is the youngest brother, barely 16 years old but already skilled with the war spear that's been passed down through their family for generations. Killing him will complete your trial, but it will also make you a child killer in the eyes of your new family. Not exactly the ideal foundation for a happy marriage. The legal implications were complex and often contradictory. Trial by combat was considered a form of divine judgment, with victory proving that God approved of the marriage. But it also created blood debts and family feuds that could last for generations, as relatives of the defeated challengers sought revenge for their deaths. The young spearman fights with the reckless courage of youth, making aggressive attacks that leave him vulnerable to counterstrikes. You could probably kill him easily, but doing so would destroy any chance of happiness with his sister, who's already lost 2 brothers to your blade. The economic consequences were staggering. Families often lost their primary breadwinners and protectors during these combat trials, leaving widows and children destitute, while the successful groom gained a wife but inherited responsibility for supporting the relatives of the men he'd killed. As your sword pierces the youngest brother's chest and his life ebbs away in the muddy field, you realize that your victory has come at a price that makes the marriage itself seem almost meaningless. You've proven your worthiness as a warrior, but you've also destroyed the family you were hoping to join. The irony is crushing. A tradition designed to ensure strong marriages has instead created a foundation of grief, resentment, and trauma that will probably poison your relationship from the very beginning. Your wedding night will be spent consoling a bride who's mourning the 3 brothers you killed to win her hand. Your beloved approaches across the blood-soaked field, stepping over the bodies of her dead brothers to embrace the man who murdered them in the name of love. The expression on her face is a mixture of joy, grief, and horror that perfectly captures the twisted nature of this matrimonial tradition. As you hold your bride-to-be while she weeps for her slaughtered family, you can't help but think that this tradition makes all the previous horrors seem almost civilized by comparison. At least those Polynesian scarification ceremonies only tortured the people who chose to undergo them, while this requires you to murder innocent men whose only crime was trying to protect their sister. Remember that chivalry mob violence? Suddenly being attacked by angry neighbors seems preferable to being forced to kill your future in-laws as proof of your romantic devotion. That Germanic trial by combat might have required murdering your in-laws, but at least the violence was honest and straightforward. Unlike colonial American bundling traditions, where courting couples were forced to spend entire nights together in the same bed while wrapped in separate sacks or separated by wooden boards, creating a bizarre combination of enforced intimacy and physical restraint that regularly led to hypothermia, suffocation, and sexual assault disguised as supervised courtship. You're lying in a freezing New England farmhouse in 1750, sewn into a heavy canvas sack that extends from your neck to your toes, while your potential suitor occupies the other half of the narrow bed in his own cloth prison. The bundling tradition was supposed to allow young couples to get acquainted during long winter nights without wasting precious firewood on separate rooms. But what you're experiencing feels more like being buried alive than romantic courtship. The practical origins of bundling made sense in harsh colonial conditions. Fuel was expensive, houses were small, and families needed ways for young people to spend time together without squandering resources on heating multiple rooms. But the execution created a nightmarish scenario where couples were essentially mummified together, unable to move freely while being expected to conduct meaningful conversations and develop emotional intimacy. Your bundling sack is made of rough homespun cloth that chafes against your skin with every movement, and the tight stitching makes it impossible to adjust your position or relieve pressure points. The fabric becomes damp with perspiration and breath, creating a clammy microclimate that breeds bacteria and makes every breath feel like you're drowning in humid air. Here's what makes colonial bundling particularly dangerous. The combination of physical restraint and close proximity created perfect conditions for accidental suffocation, especially when couples were exhausted from long days of farm work and might fall into deep sleep while pressed against each other. Many bundling deaths were attributed to natural causes, when they were actually cases of positional asphyxia. The supervision aspect was supposed to prevent sexual impropriety, but it often had the opposite effect. Parents would check on bundling couples periodically throughout the night, creating a voyeuristic dynamic where intimate conversations were interrupted by adults peering into the bedroom and examining the integrity of the bundling arrangements. Your suitor tries to turn toward you, but his movements pull the shared blanket away from your body, exposing you to the bitter cold that seeps through the uninsulated walls. The temperature in the room is probably below freezing, and without the ability to generate warmth through movement, you're at serious risk of hypothermia despite being fully clothed and wrapped in heavy fabric. The bundling board, a wooden plank placed down the center of the bed, was supposed to provide additional separation between couples, but it often created more problems than it solved. The hard edge would dig into your back and ribs throughout the night, making comfortable sleep impossible while creating pressure sores and bruises that could become infected. Historians still argue whether bundling was primarily about resource conservation or parental control over courtship, but the physical dangers were undeniable. Church records from colonial New England document numerous deaths attributed to bundling accidents, though the exact causes were often obscured by euphemistic language and social embarrassment. The psychological impact was equally disturbing. You're expected to develop romantic feelings for someone while being physically restrained and unable to express affection through touch or movement. The artificial intimacy created by forced proximity often led to relationships based more on shared trauma than genuine compatibility. The sexual tension is overwhelming and frustrating. You're lying inches away from someone you're attracted to, but any attempt at physical contact could result in accusations of impropriety and immediate termination of the courtship. The bundling system created a perfect storm of arousal and frustration that drove many couples to desperate measures. But here's the most twisted aspect of this tradition. Bundling was often used as a test of moral character, with parents deliberately creating tempting situations to see if young couples would maintain their virtue under pressure. Couples who successfully resisted temptation were considered marriage material, while those who succumbed were often forced into immediate wedlock regardless of their actual compatibility. The morning examination was humiliating and invasive. Parents would inspect the bundling sacks and bedding for evidence of sexual activity, checking for stains, tears, or other signs that the couple had violated the rules. These inspections were conducted with the thoroughness of criminal investigations, turning intimate relationships into matters of public scrutiny. The health consequences extended beyond immediate physical dangers. The prolonged immobilization and restricted circulation often led to blood clots, muscle atrophy, and joint problems that could affect couples for months after their bundling experiences. Some young people developed chronic pain conditions that made normal physical activity difficult. The social dynamics were incredibly complex. Families would often arrange bundling sessions between young people who barely knew each other, forcing strangers into intimate physical proximity while expecting them to develop genuine romantic connections. The artificial nature of these relationships created marriages based more on convenience than love. As dawn finally breaks and your parents arrive to unbundle you from your cloth prison, you realize that this night of supposed courtship has been more like a kidnapping where you were held captive with your own potential spouse. Your body is stiff and aching from hours of immobilization, and you're not sure whether you've developed feelings for your suitor or just Stockholm Syndrome. The irony is devastating. A tradition designed to promote moral courtship has instead created conditions that encourage deception, frustration, and physical danger. The same system that was supposed to protect young people's virtue has turned romantic relationships into endurance contests where survival matters more than compatibility. The bundling tradition gradually died out as heating became more affordable and social attitudes toward courtship evolved, but not before subjecting thousands of colonial couples to nights of sanctioned torture disguised as romantic opportunity. The practice that was supposed to bring young people together often drove them apart, creating associations between love and suffering that probably affected their marriages for years. As you're finally freed from your bundling sack and feel circulation returning to your numb limbs, you can't help but reflect on the journey we've taken together through history's most dangerous wedding traditions. From Roman sheep entrail readings to Germanic death duels, from Chinese foot binding to Aztec heart sacrifices, we've witnessed how the pursuit of love and marriage has driven human societies to create some of the most brutal and bizarre rituals imaginable. The common thread running through all these traditions is the willingness of people to endure incredible suffering in the name of love, social acceptance, and cultural conformity. Whether it was brides burning alive on funeral pyres or grooms fighting to the death for marriage rights, our ancestors transformed the most beautiful human emotion into occasions for systematic torture and violence. But perhaps there's something oddly comforting in knowing that modern wedding stress, dealing with difficult in-laws, budget constraints, and seating arrangements, pales in comparison to the life-threatening ordeals faced by couples throughout history. The next time you're worried about your wedding cake or flower arrangements, just remember that at least nobody's expecting you to drink potentially poisoned sake or have your feet systematically broken in preparation for marriage. These dangerous traditions remind us that progress isn't just about technology or politics. It's also about gradually learning to separate love from violence, celebration from suffering, and tradition from torture. The fact that we can now get married without risking death, disfigurement, or dismemberment represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, even if we rarely think about it that way. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream not of the horrors we've explored, but of the simple miracle of modern romance, where the biggest danger you face is choosing between chicken or fish for your reception dinner, and where saying, "I do," doesn't require you to literally risk your life for love. Sweet dreams, and may your own romantic adventures be filled with joy rather than the deadly traditions that once made marriage a matter of survival rather than celebration.